Okay, the talk is promised to be in English, so it will be in English, but mostly it will be live coding, so it's understandable in any language. And today we will speak about a thing that any front-end developer was dealing with, and any front-end developer knows the pain about it. It will be about a global state and how to work with it asynchronously. And I will quickly reintroduce myself. My name is Natalia, and I'm a core team member of Vue.js. That's why the demo in this talk will be using Vue.js, even though the problem is framework agnostic. And the solution I will be speaking about actually is coming from React ecosystem, but we won't speak about this with Vue. I work as a staff front-end engineer at GitLab. And just so you know, I have two colleagues here from GitLab, so I cannot lie about this. We have 3 ways of managing a global state, 3. And none of them makes us happy. It's still 3 kinds of pain. And I'm a Google Dev expert in web technologies, which has nothing to do with my talk, but it's nice to say because there is a word Google in this. So, global state. Basically some data that you have in your application that should be available everywhere. For any kind of component, any kind of root, everywhere. And when we look at the global state with our main state management in Vue, Vuex, it looks quite simple and intuitive. So imagine that I have a count, and I want to share this counter in every single component. Simple, short, understandable. Now, of course, I need to change this count somehow, and again, with Vue, with React as well, you cannot just change it with a state count plus plus. You need to call a mutation. And it looks like this. The increment is just a method that you call, and it does state count plus plus. So, still good. If you're using Vue, you probably know that there is this belief that you cannot commit mutation in the component. So, for those people, we also add an action. Increment, commit increment. Still looks fine. Not a lot of boilerplate. Everything is good here. So, what we're dealing here with? We have a data that we change synchronously. This data is non-persistent. We only store counter on the front-end side, on the client. When you refresh a page, we don't have this data. It has a single source of changes. We have a store, we update a count in the store. It has only one source. And it still does not create a lot of boilerplate. Debatable with actions, but still manageable. Now let's get to the fun part. Let's add some server data, which happens in any real-life front-end application you're using. Still simple if we do it like this. We have some characters, an array, we want to fetch it from the server, and we have an asynchronous action that fetches characters, we have a mutation to state, but there is a problem that your UX won't be the best. You need, of course, a login state and some kind of error state, because what if your request is failing? And this creates a chain of changes. Now we have, this is actually what we use at GitLab as a convention. If you call some asynchronous fetch, you start with request characters, you go with receive character success, setting login false, and then you have received characters error. Now we have 3 mutations just to change the same piece of data. And of course, we have an action that will do all this stuff here. Calling fetch characters, committing 3 different kinds of mutation, and this becomes a pain. And you will need to write this for every single kind of request you're doing to the server. Vuex does not have anything built in. Neither Redux has, neither use state, MobX, whatever, Pinia in Vue. All our state management tools are not designed to deal with asynchronous data. They are perfect to work with a synchronous one. Hello, boilerplate. Some companies automate this chain, but still a lot of boilerplate. And there are still questions. Very common thing. I believe I see this question every 2 days. how to write a getter that will give me my data if data is already in Vuex, but if data is not there, how to make this getter dispatch an action. There is no such getter. You will need to re-implement it in the component or in the root of the Vuex. How to keep my data up to date? WebSockets, long polling, no built-in tools anyway. You will write it yourself. What if two components start fetching the same query simultaneously? Handle it yourself. Our state management tool is not designed for this. So we're dealing here with asynchronous requests that are persisted remotely on the server. You're not controlling them, the server controls the data. You're only creating the copy on the front end. And it has a shared ownership. You don't own this data. Not all states are born equal. Let's take a quick look on how more or less real-life application looks in Vuex. So there is a small demo app, like super small, let's make it a bit bigger, that fetches 10 characters of June. And if I click on the character, I have this character fetched as well. Let's take a look at the code in Vuex. So I have my store here. I try to simplify it as much as possible so I don't have request characters and so on. I'm setting loading state and error state here and setting characters, and it's still a lot, 2 different sets for characters and for character. And as you can see, for character, it's really flaky. Because what I'm doing here, I'm relying on the already existing state characters array where I'm trying to find a character and change it with the data. And I have my action, 2 actions that actually fetch them, and characters, getter, of course. So what I'm actually doing here, let's go to the network tab. I will increase it as well. And if I'm on the main page, I'm only fetching characters right now. I go to the character, there is fetching this 1. And if I go back, of course, there won't be any kind of fetch. As you can see, it's still 1. Because what I'm doing on my root, I'm fetching the data already on the mounted. But there is a problem. If I go to the single character, and if I refresh the page, I'm fetching not only a single character, but all the characters list. Because I'm relying on this array to populate it. I'm already overfetching data. I can optimize it further, and the more I optimize it, the more code I will be writing with Vuex. So, far from perfect. What kind of alternatives do we have? If you're working with graph, so there is a global state. Forgot about this. But honestly, there is no global state. There is some local state that we have in locally and only locally, and there is what I call server cache. That's the data you fetch from the API and store in your global state manager just as a copy. Of course, if you're working with GraphQL, you know that there is Polo client as an alternative. And what a Polo client is doing, when you fetch the data with a GraphQL from a Polo client, it will cache any single query that you're doing automatically. In your component, it will be looking like this. I'm using query. It's the same syntax for Vue and React. I call use query, and characters query is just a document of GraphQL. And I have result loading and error automatically. I don't need to handle loading state, neither error state. It's done, but it's a Polo client. And of course, everything is cached. So when I hit this query the second time, it's already there. I'm not hitting the API, I'm just getting it from the local cache. What is characters query? Just a GraphQL document, basically this. And I can use it with REST. I can adopt a Polo client to be used with REST. I can write a local resolver that will perform access get. Data will be stored in cache. And in one of my previous talks, I was telling that I can also use it for the state management, for the local state management. If I want to add character locally, I can write a resolver for this mutation. But look how much code is this. It's still a boilerplate. The problem with a Polo client is it solves perfectly the problem of the server cache, but it struggles with the local state. So for Vuex, Redux, MobX, everything, they're perfect for local state and struggle with server cache. For Apollo client, nice for server cache, struggles with the local state. So maybe one size doesn't fit all. Maybe we're trying to use the same tool for two different problems. And I believe I already can see the paradigm, but there is a single source of truth, and you are trying to have two. No, there is no single source of truth, because the truth in this case is not in your local state. The truth is on server. You already have two sources of truth, your local data and your server data, and you're trying to combine them with one source. And that's why it's problematic. There is a solution. People who work with React probably already tried it or at least heard about it. It's called React Query. And there is a Vue wrapper, that kind of new, which is just exposing the same API for Vue. And let's try to get our hands dirty. Let's try to write the code with Vue Query to see how it works with the server cache. I will go to my ID and switch to my initial branch. Is the code visible for everyone, especially for the back rows? Fine? Okay, if it's not, just yell a bit, and I will try to change it to something bigger. So I will close AppView because we won't be doing anything here, and let's start fetching our characters. I'm using the local server running on 4000, and there are three different methods when getting characters, one character, and having a mutation to add them. But we'll see if we will have time for the mutation. So first step is, let's start fetching data. We will have some data from the query, and I will give it an alias. We will be using useQuery method, not useQuery client, just useQuery. And this is the method from the Vue query library. The first parameter here is the name of the query. We will need it later. For now, it's just a key. And the second parameter here is actually our method. It's called fetcher in the documentation of useQuery. And this is any method. You can use REST API, GraphQL API, anything that returns a promise. In our case, this is Axios REST API call. Now I need to unpack this data a bit. So I will say that const characters, because this is the response. It will be data that has some nested properties. I will use Vue computed property to just get it from there. And this computed property will return us characters result, value, because this is VueRef, an object that has the single property value, reactive object, data. And we can remove these characters from here now. Let's go to our browser, to the main page. And as you can see, we're fetching characters right now, just with an API call, like this. Nothing fancy so far, we're just doing a REST API call. And we don't have anything for character, so I will quickly add the same on the character component. So basically, we want value like here, data. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to say, of course, similarly to Apollo client, it exposes is loading, which is a loading state, and is error, which is the error state. And we can remove these as well. How does it look with the loading state? There is this very short moment. I won't throttle my network right now that there is a loading here. And if we want our API to have an error, you can see what happens here. By default, our client will retry it 3 times with a given interval. and then it will throw an error. You can disable this behavior. It's completely fine. You can just pass retry false to our data. And of course, you can do the polling as well. You can also pass a parameter to use query with refetch interval, so it will be fetching data one by one. So let's go to the character, re-implement the same thing here to see how it works with the caching. Because right now we're only fetching data, but we don't do any caching on the front end. So again, use query. Why it's trying to go with the client every single time? In this case, it's a bit more complicated because our character is just a root that accepts one prop, ID of the character, and I need to fetch it by ID. So the syntax is a bit more detailed. It will be character, and then the second element in this array is props ID. And then I'm calling my fetcher, which is get character. With this props ID. And the same way, we are exposing the data value is equal to computed property, which returns us data, value data. And the same we return is loading here. So we have characters. We go to this root and something is completely wrong. Like every single time with live demo. What exactly is? Oh, is loading is already declared, of course. Refreshing the page. Now we're fetching the character here, and let's go to network to see what's going on. I fetch the characters. I fetch the single character. I go back. Characters are not fetched. The same here, but if we wait for 10 seconds and we will go back to the characters a bit more, probably I'm just counting too fast, you can see that there is a refetch of the character. Why? There is a feature that I really miss in Apollo client, but I added it to the settings in this query client. You can see that there is a stale time. By default, in the Vue query and in React query, every single query after it's fetched is considered stale. What does it mean? When you remount the component, which happens on the routing, the query is refetched. It's stale. We need to fetch it again from the server. We can define the interval of time after which we consider our data stale. It's super nice if you want to have the same data when user stays on the same page, but if after like 5 minutes user goes to the different route, you want to refetch. You don't want to show the stale data. This is one of the really great things. Of course, you can still do polling if you want an actual data, but for the stale time, it's super good. It's 20 seconds here. In real life application, it will be from 1 minute to 10 minutes, really depending on your application. So far, we only are fetching data. We have a cache that lives for 20 seconds in our application, and stale time can be specified per query. So maybe you want some queries to be more dynamic in fetching data. Maybe you want some queries to just be fetched and forgotten. Like you can set stale time to infinity in this particular case. So right now, let's try the last thing in the live coding. Let's try to change our data and see how this applies to the cache, because it's a problem in Vuex as well. So we will write a mutation right now in our home view. We want to add some character. Let's call it new char. This is just an object with an ID of 12 and name of test, just for the sake of rendering the list. And let's write the mutation. There is a method called useMutation that returns us a mutate method that we will be calling in our application. And this is useMutation. Here, as a parameter, we can accept whatever you want to pass to this mutate. In my particular case, new char is static, so I will be just passing it directly. And we will call add character, which is just a post request. You can see this in the API. Just instance post characters and new character. New char. And of course, I need to call it somewhere in my application, so I will just add a button. Add character. And I will call mutate on the click. Oh, not like this. It's just a mutate. So let's go. Let's return back to our characters. There is a button here at the bottom. And I forgot to return it. So right now, we sent a post request, nothing has happened with the UI, which would be the case with Vuex and Redux and everything as well, because we didn't update the UI in any possible way. And we didn't update the cache automatically with this mutation. If I refresh the page, oh, right now it's 500, but it's added to the server. I wonder why it's not showing up, but okay, let's invalidate the query. So there are two different ways in which you can update the UI. First one is say this query is not correct anymore. It's called invalidating queries. You send a mutation, you want to fetch the new data from the server. Not super effective, but it works. For this, we will have onSuccess hook, where we can finally access the query client. That's why it was importing it for so long. So const query client. Here we are accessing the whole instance of the query client that is used in Vue query and React query. So on success, we want to say query client, invalidate queries, and here we finally use this key we were given to the query characters. This is basically it. So when I'm adding anything, right now it's complains at me because we already have this on the server. I'm adding it, and as you can see, it refetches characters. I will probably need to restart the server to make it work properly. So let's just do one more server.js. Server is running. See, right now, server is awake, and we have test2. And I can do it one more time. Now you can see the query is invalidated. When I added a mutation, we're fetching the characters immediately. Again, not super effective. This is a lot on your server because you have one more query, and this is already a lot on your frontend because you're fetching data again. So what else we can do? Instead of refetching the query, we can change the cache manually. We can set query data. Again, here we need to specify the query and the data that we will be changing. And the data will be our old characters value, because this is a ref, and success receives the response from the server, res data. And again, we will need to do something else, like more IDs. And now I'm adding the character, but there is no refetch. If you wonder what is this is only a mutation. There is no refetch after this one. This tool is designed not to replace the Vuex, Redux, or anything, not to replace your local state manager, but be an additional tool. So you can handle your async data with a Vue or React query, and you can handle your local state with your Vuex. And thank you for listening. That's actually it.